Russia has been fighting in a war for months that they thought would end in a few weeks. Because of this, Vladimir Putin has said some pretty scary things, like how Russia could use nuclear weapons to help its position in the conflict. But Russia has been pulling back recently as its troops get ready for the next phase of their attack on the Ukrainian people. Putin thought it would be easy to force his way into Ukraine and take it over, but he has clearly failed. It's both good and bad to hear this. It's good news because it means that Ukrainian troops are still standing up to Russia. It is bad news because it means that Putin is making plans for a new war. One that could cause the world to end. As far as we know, Putin's new plan to win is made up of a number of different parts, some of which have nothing to do with traditional fighting. The crazy leader of Russia wants to beat Ukraine in strange ways, and you might be a part of his plan, even though you don't want to be. One of the most important things on Putin's agenda right now is to wait. It could look like he doesn't want the war to keep going. But this is only partly true. Putin is counting on Western countries to stop helping Ukraine. If European countries and the US don't give Ukraine weapons and supplies, Russian forces will win in the long run. But would any of the countries that help Ukraine let this happen? You might not want to hear the answer to this question right now. A financial crisis is coming for a lot of countries, including the US and a large part of Europe. There are many reasons for this, but the war in Ukraine and Russia's decision to stop exporting oil and gas, while also forcing other OPEC countries to cut the amount of fossil fuels they export, are two of the main ones. These aren't the only things that are causing inflation and slowing down of the economy, but they are a big part of it. Putin sees as a waiting game, the EU and the US have struggled to keep their finances stable. He is betting that Russia will be able to stay in the fight with Ukraine long enough for the economies of the NATO countries to collapse. If this happens, things will probably slow down or stop in Ukraine. At least, this is what Putin plans, but he doesn't just think he can wait out the lead and economies of the Western world. It's also you? Putin and other Russian military leaders have said that the West is weak and will either get tired of the war or move on to something else. The scary thing is that he might be right, because many people all over the world get their news by following trends and what they are fed by social media and algorithms. If people in other countries stop paying attention and stop helping Ukraine, there's a good chance that politicians won't feel the need to help and support the country anymore. Vladimir Putin has made it clear that he will keep fighting as long as it takes. And he is betting that people will stop supporting Ukraine long before he stops wanting to take it over. To be fair, that probably is the case. As times become harder on families in the United States and Europe, due to increasing energy prices, inflation and economic slowdown, people will start worrying more about putting food on their table and paying their bills than supporting Ukraine. The ability to wait out the rest of the world until Ukraine is starved of help and support is one key component of Putin's plan to win the war, and if the last several months have been any indication, this might actually come to pass. As many NATO countries already have problems brewing at home. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson stepped down and was replaced by Liz Truss, who has now resigned after 44 days of serving as Prime Minister in France. The party of President Emmanuel Macron lost the most seats in both Parliament and the US. The midterm elections were predictably turbulent. There is nothing wrong with electing new people to government jobs. But these big changes are happening at a time when the economic future of the world looks more uncertain than ever. Putin is watching how the governments of the West try to keep the support of their people. Only time will tell if the US and Europe's financial and political problems make people less likely to support Ukraine. But the longer Putin and Russian forces can hold out, the more likely it is that people outside the conflict zone will turn their attention to other problems or the next big crisis. Because, let's be honest, a new danger always seems to be around the corner. Misinformation is also a very important part of Russia's plan to win the war. Putin and his friends have been controlling the country for decades by spreading false information. But when it comes to war, they're taking this tactic to new levels. Putin is trying to make the Russian people forget who they are by saying that the West wants to use cancel culture to get rid of their culture. He has even said that the West wants to censor the Russian people themselves and that he is only fighting for their freedom. Putin has taken away the freedom he says he wants to give his people. Some extremist groups and Russians who may not have thought the war was necessary at first have come together because of these lies. However, the manipulation of the truth doesn't stop there every day. The people of Russia are told that the special operation is going well, yet it's taking longer than expected, but Putin reassures them that everything is going according to plan, and nothing will stop them to further demonize the enemy. Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry Sergei Lavrov has even used the media to spread misinformation such as Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky being a Nazi. This is a very strange move, especially since Zelensky is Jewish. The misinformation being spread by Russia to its citizens and onto the internet, for people who believe in conspiracies all over the world to see, is very dangerous. It's also part of Russia's plan to keep the public on their side in the war with Ukraine. Russia knows that they are a major supplier of oil and natural gas to much of Europe, especially Germany. Cutting off the supply of fossil fuels has already caused many Europeans to suffer from high utility prices. The reality is that many people in Europe will not be able to pay their bills and could have their electricity or heat shut off in the coming months. As winter comes to the northern hemisphere, Russia will send less fossil fuels to the EU, which will cause a lot of trouble. And Putin has built this into his plan to win the war. Multiple high-level officials in the Kremlin have bragged that EU residents will be feeling the impact of these sanctions more than Russia will. The plan is to basically hold the people of the EU hostage by cutting off their oil and gas supplies. This will cause prices to go through the roof and lessen support for Ukraine. Russia also hopes that this will cause civil unrest and force European governments to worry more about what's going on at home than helping Ukraine fight Russia. They're also betting that as people in Europe suffer, the governments will lift certain sanctions on Russia. Russia would win the war if it did all of these things. In the end, it's become abundantly clear that relying heavily on Russia for energy resources was a huge mistake. A mistake Putin is now exposed, but it's not just in Europe, but Russia's hoarding of natural resources is being felt. Even in the United States, gas prices are going up again, which is making a lot of people very angry. Russia believes that as oil prices increased, NATO countries will be more willing to loosen restrictions to bring oil and gas prices down to keep their citizens happy. This would be bad because it would let Russia do even more damage in Ukraine. Putin is using the Western world's dependence on fossil fuels to get what he wants from governments. As a people, citizens in the United States and Europe might accept these rising costs and maintain their support for Ukraine for a time. But when people can't afford to heat their homes or when higher gas prices are too much of a hassle, pressure will be put on elected officials to do something by making a deal with Russia again. This is another part of Russia's plan to win the war. If Russia can make enough problems and discomfort for the average person in Europe and the US, the lifelines that are being provided to Ukraine could be cut. At that point, all Putin would have to do is keep sending troops across the border and wait until Ukrainian forces ran out of supplies. Russia is also not too worried about waiting out sanctions and fighting a prolonged war because they believe one particular ally will always have their back, the country that is an economic powerhouse and more than willing to buy their oil and gas. China has the world's second largest economy. And although they do not support the war, they're more than happy to buy resources and goods from Russia. Putin's main plan for the future is to rely on allies to keep buying Russian oil and gas. Russia thinks that China will help make up for any economic losses that come from the sanctions that the UN and NATO have put on them. Russia's dependence on China is especially important because it lets Russia get the technology and other goods it needs to keep its war machine running. China is more than willing to purchase Russian oil at a huge discount and help boost its own economy and output. But China has made it clear that it won't join the war and that it won't give Russia weapons or military vehicles in the open. China needs to keep buying Russia's exports to pay for the war, but Russia also needs military equipment badly. Something China so far has refused to supply. Russia's artillery, tanks and weapons are mostly from the Cold War era, and supplies are running low. Sanctions have hurt Russia's ability to make things, but Putin won't admit it because he thinks it would show weakness. Instead, most Russian media outlets spread lies that China and Russia are happily working together to keep Russia's economy going while they manufacture more weapons and military vehicles to fight the war against Ukraine. So, let's talk about Russia's more millet ways to win the war in the future that are based on chance. Recently, there has been less fighting. But Putin says everything is going according to plan. He makes the Russian people feel better. There is a new plan being put in place. Russia's military leaders don't really have a plan, so it's not clear what their strategy is. But Russia will send more soldiers during the next part of the attack. Russia has now sent more than 300,000 soldiers to Ukraine to fight. At first, they thought that their first group of soldiers would be enough to wipe out the enemy. But this clearly wasn't true. At the start of the war, Putin decided to move a lot of raw materials. He didn't need an army. Many people in the Kremlin didn't agree with the decision, but Putin didn't listen. In his new plan, Putin is sending more troops to Ukraine, which is what his advisors told him to do months ago. Putin won't say anything. But since he told more people to join the army, more than 200,000 Russians have left the country. At this point, it's clear that not everyone believes what Putin and the Russian government are saying. Even if something happened to Vladimir Putin, such as an assassination or getting eaten by a Russian brown bear, the war would likely continue. This is because the Kremlin has put so much money into the war and thinks it has the right to take Ukraine and make it part of Russia again. Young men and women will still have no choice but to join the Russian army, as part of a plan for Russia to beat Ukraine. But Russia has also been threatening to use a weapon so bad that it could start World War III. This is also part of their plan to win the war, which is bad news for the rest of us. Russia has made it clear that using nuclear weapons to win the war in Ukraine is not out of the question. Putin has only talked about using tactical nukes, which weigh about a kilogram and have a blast radius of about 50 meters, so far. Anyone within a half-mile of the explosion would probably get a lot of radiation, which would kill 50% of them. This is a lot less powerful than strategic nukes, which can be over 1,000 times stronger. However, the use of tactical nukes would change the course of the war completely and could result in the end of the world. In Russia's plan, it seems most probable that tactical nukes would be used if Russian forces were pushed back by Ukrainian soldiers. In this case, a tactical nuclear weapon could be fired from an artillery cannon or from a battleship or submarine using short-range missiles. The fallout wouldn't be nearly as big as that of a strategic nuke, but the area around it would be irradiated. The biggest problem with this part of Russia's plan is that it would force NATO to act right away. The US and Europe can't and won't let Putin use a nuclear weapon without being punished. There would have to be a response of some kind. Even though Putin knows this, he still thinks that the West isn't strong enough to stand up to Russia. Most people don't want a nuclear war to happen, so this could be true. But using nuclear weapons would most likely result in some kind of militaristic response by NATO. Although NATO might not actually need to retaliate, because if Russia did use a tactical nuke in Ukraine, almost every country on the planet would turn against them, including China. China has already made it clear that they adhere to a strict no-first-use nuclear doctrine, which means nukes should only be used for defensive purposes. This is not how Russia plans to use them. It's not clear if Russia would be willing to suffer the consequences and become a global pariah just to keep Ukrainian forces from pushing them out of their territory, but Putin may not have a choice. Putin's main and most important plan is to win the war by any means possible, no matter what. This is because if Russia doesn't win, Putin will lose power and will probably be put to death for his mistakes. Vladimir Putin is the most dangerous man in the world because this is obviously the last thing he wants. Russia as a country could get out of the war in a number of ways, but Putin would give up his life to do so. So, the only thing Putin can't change about his plan is that he must win. As Russia rethinks its approach to the war, Putin will make sure that no matter what happens, the Russian people will see him as strong. Because of this, Russia isn't trying to negotiate. Instead, it is sending out more troops and trying to weaken the country that is giving Ukraine weapons and resources. Even if Russia can't win the war in Ukraine, they will probably fight until the end, because if they don't, everyone in the Kremlin right now would be sent away or killed. The scariest thing about this situation is that it reminds me of where the German government was during World War II. During World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II and his advisors knew it was impossible to win, but they kept sending their troops to fight for years. They did this because they all knew that if Germany lost, the government would be overthrown and there would be a revolution. History has taught us this. The exact same thing happened. Putin and his allies also know that if Russia fails to secure Ukraine, a similar revolution could happen in their country. It might not lead to Nazism, but there would be a change in power, and Russia could even become a capitalist democracy, which would be worse than death for some Russian government officials. This is why Putin and Russia's leadership are so dangerous. So, their plan to win the war is less of a plan and more of a do-whatever-it-takes attitude. Even if that means starting a nuclear war, diplomacy is part of Russia's plan to win, even if it means starting a nuclear war. If Putin could get enough military victories and concessions from you to make his losses look like wins, he might be willing to use diplomatic means to end the war. This doesn't look likely to happen right now. But Putin's plan does depend on him being able to negotiate at some point, especially if Ukraine keeps doing as well in the war as it has been. In Russia's timeline, if they don't take over Ukraine in the next year or two, they will lose. For Russia to come to the table for peace talks, some other parts of Russia's plan need to happen first. The most important of these is that Europe needs to fall into economic and political chaos, which is why they stopped giving money to Ukraine. If this doesn't happen, Putin won't be able to get a good deal for Russia at the table. This would not be acceptable. But if everything goes as planned, Russia will have moved further into Ukraine and will only have to deal with a small number of rebels. At that point, Putin could say that Ukraine was basically his and go to the table of talks to stop the fighting. Even if Russia wasn't sure to win, less help from other countries might make Ukraine give up on some of their demands. This could stay, and parts of Ukraine like Kyiv will stay independent because of it. As long as Russia takes control of most of the country, neither Ukraine nor NATO will be happy with this outcome. But if the economies of other countries are in shambles and they stop sending Ukraine military supplies, this might be the best deal they can get. It's a scary thought, but Russia could, in theory, wait out Ukraine in the rest of the world if they keep cutting oil and gas exports from OPEC countries they control. There could be a very real global crisis. All of these are things that Putin thinks will make his plan work. But Russia's leaders may want to talk as soon as possible because the large-scale mobilization of their forces is very unpopular with the Russian people. Most people join the army when they are forced to because they are afraid of what will happen if they don't. Others leave the country. Most Russians do not want to be forced to fight in the war with Ukraine right now. Putin can still say that the war is a way to protect Russia's way of life and culture by spreading false information. Putin says that if Ukraine is allowed to join the EU or become allies with the West, it will only be a matter of time before NATO invades Russia and forces everyone to become a capitalist. After years of fighting, this argument probably won't be strong enough, which is why Putin might be willing to talk as long as he can save face. Putin will never sit down and try to reach an agreement if Ukraine is still in a strong position to negotiate. This is because it would cause him to lose power, which would probably kill him. Most experts agree that Putin is just trying to improve his bargaining position at this point, and that he will eventually come to the table. But if Putin thinks he'll lose the war, there's still a real chance that he will. He could use nuclear weapons to attack Ukraine, which is the most extreme part of his plan. It's very scary. But if Putin had to choose between losing power and starting a nuclear war that would destroy the whole world, no matter how you look at it, he might be crazy enough to choose nuclear holocaust. The plan Putin has is a mess. It depends on Russia doing a lot of things right and the rest of the world doing a lot of things wrong. It's not to say that his plan won't work. There's a very real possibility that people will grow weary of the war and support for Ukraine will fade. This is a bad idea. But the longer the war goes on, the worse things will get because the economy will fall and there won't be enough oil and gas, and the less people will care about Ukraine. So, the question now is whether or not Russia can keep up with the West and wear down NATO and Ukraine in the long run. At the moment, about 70% of Germans want their country to help Ukraine, even if it means that energy prices will go up over the next few months. But it will be interesting to see what that number looks like if this winter is especially cold and people can't afford to heat their homes. About 72% of Americans are in favor of giving Ukraine more military aid. But again, if gas prices go up, this number could go down, which is how Russia plans to win the war. About 58% of Americans have said they think the US government should support Ukraine for as long as it takes to beat Russia. Much of the sentiment likely carries over from the Cold War era. However, almost all Americans agree that what Russia is doing is wrong. The problem is that Putin could get away with murder if the rest of the world doesn't pay attention to the crisis in Ukraine. Considering how things are going, many people don't think Russia can keep up its current military push because the work looks like it could take years. After years of sanctions and boycotts of Russian goods, this will soon start to hurt the average Russian citizen, and Putin may need to shift his attention to domestic issues as life gets even harder. At the moment, he has too much power and influence for an uprising to be six. But as the war with Ukraine drains military forces and equipment, Putin may find that his plan to win falls apart and the Russian people start to hold him responsible for what he has done. We can't forget what's going on if we don't want Russia's plan to win the war to work. Putin is counting on this, and as long as the rest of the world stands behind Ukraine, there is a chance that Putin will have to deal with his own angry people.